So, I mean, when I was saying, when I saw you in Manchester, or I went up to Manchester and you were around, and I'd read about you in Blues and Soul and your charts and all that stuff that you were, you were a big name. But the first time I saw you actually would have been on the television.
Yeah.
Right? Because you were the first person to mix
live
on television, right?
And on UK TV.
On UK.
I don't know if anyone did it in the States.
So, and you're talking about the mixing thing. So when I hear you, when you were scratching, was that more of a hip hop type of approach you were doing? How were you? What was the influence there? Or were you beat matching at that time as well? Was it a bit of all of it? I remember you scratching.
Yeah, I mean, I did just at the beginning. I mean, very rudimentary scratching.
1983.
Yeah, we were just. Really, these ideas were coming in from America. I mean, one of the first things that really started to kind of become apparent was that the names on the records who were remixing them, T. Scott, Francois Kevorkian, Shep Pettibone, Larry Levan, Jellybean Benitez, these were all DJs. And I remember thinking, these are DJs. I want to do this. I'm a DJ. And I went around, I knew all the record company people in London, and I was saying at the time, I want to remix a record. And they're saying, well, American DJs remix records. It was and I was really banging my head against a brick wall. Eventually I had to kind of make my own records to kind of find a way in at the time. But then, of course, mixing originally from a UK perspective started to be talked about in '78, and an American DJ called Greg James. He's actually Argentinian, but he was based in the States. He was a friend of Richie Cassy, who was at Studio 54 at the time. He came over to a club called the Embassy. And the Embassy fancied itself as a bit of a London Studio 54 with a few celebs and record company people. And he pretty much introduced mixing into the UK. He then went up to Leeds and worked at the Warehouse. And he recommended Ian Levine for Heaven, and Ian Levine went there. So in a very slow process, because I think what a lot of people don't understand is that I think there's a tendency for people to think that what happened in the UK was following what was going on in America, which it wasn't at all. It was a completely different world. In fact, the scene in the UK probably has deeper roots than what was going on there. Like the scene, there's a club called The Scene, a DJ called Guy Stevens in London in the early 60s, which is where the mods were going. He was playing rhythm and blues and soul music and ska music. And then you had in Manchester a guy called Roger Eagle at the Twisted Wheel, again playing this black American music. These guys were importing it. They were writing to, labels in Chicago and getting records. And they were the originals who were opening the channels that we came into later down the line. So there was a absolutely kind of deep-rooted black music scene within the UK that went further back as well, through the blues, back into the Second World War when the black GIs were coming over and the whole swing thing was going on, but really galvanising in the 60s. And so we had that lineage in the UK that went through, and that's where something like Northern Soul comes from. That comes out of the club, the Twisted Wheel, where Roger Eagle worked, but after his time. And, these specialist scenes like jazz funk, which Giles mentioned before as well. And this was separate to the New York disco thing that came in during the 70s, and the idea of mixing and the 12-inch single and all these New York inventions, and kind of merged with it. And I think the reason why rave happened in the UK, it could only happen in the UK because it was where these two things really fully collided. Because it wasn't until that point, kind of 87, 88, that I think mixing became the predominant way of DJing, and a lot of people dropped off the cliff, the old fossils of the microphone, they went by the by. But even up until that point, there was a lot of DJs in the UK still microphone based, and a lot of people still resisting this mixing style, but it all changed with, the kind of influx of house and the summers of love in Manchester and London and everything blew up from there. There was a magazine called Record Mirror in the UK, and there was a really influential column by a guy called James Hamilton, who's probably one of the fundamental figures. He goes back to the early 60s as well in British dance culture. And he took it upon himself to, you know, fly the flag of mixing. And one of the big things he did was he decided he was going to BPM all the tracks that were in his chart and any new releases, and he timed to get the BPMs, and he pushed DJs in that direction, and eventually, bit by bit, you know, the dam kind of opened up and more came into that. But like I said before, it was a long process before it kind of went right across the board. Generally, a few of the more adventurous people. I mean, from my own perspective, when I first became aware of it in '78, like a lot of other people, I tried it, but we had all these belt-driven turntables, and if you touched them, you know, the needle would jump, and so it just wasn't practical. You know, later you realise, right, they're using vari-speed decks, and then, you know, the 1200s, and when it came to that, but I mean, I went and worked abroad. I worked in Germany in 1980, and I went to a club in a city called Essen, a club called Librium. And the DJ, who I think now is a guy called Peter Romer, who's quite famous in terms of the German lineage, was mixing. He was mixing black music and alternative together. And it seemed right. I'd seen Greg James 2 years before do it, but this really made a bigger impression on me. And I thought, in the right environment, I can see myself taking this direction. And fortunately, the next year I was in the right environment, which is in Legend in Manchester. They had 3 1200s. You didn't see them in clubs at the time, so they had 3 of them. They had an amazing sound system and everything. So I had the facility to be able to do that, and that's when I approached it. So the tube thing that you mentioned was, there was a band called High Tension, a British like jazz funk band that had a couple of hits in the 70s. The lead singer was a guy called David Joseph, and he had his first solo release out. And he was on a TV program called The Tube, which was broadcast from Newcastle in the north of England. But they were doing an outside broadcast from Camden Palace, which is in London. And David Joseph was going to be on this. So they wanted to check him out. And so they came to Manchester, it was closer. By this time, I was like doing things like taking 2 copies of a record and running one, a beat, 4 beats, 2 beats behind the other, switching them around, making your own kind of live edit in a way. And I did this night with this David Joseph track, you know, an hour or so before he came on. And they heard me and said to me, would you like to come and do this on the program? And initially you think, wow, that's fantastic, that's a break, you know. And then you think, I've got to go and do it. I've literally got to go and do it live. And you know, the terror of the situation really hits you. There was a guy with a handheld camera who was just really going around. I'm like, he's going to bang the decks, and everything's queued up, and Jules Holland starts to interview me. And my eyes on these decks and this, please don't knock the deck, because everything...
And this was proper TV that
yeah.
The whole country, anyone under the age of 20 was watching that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was the biggest youth program. I mean, when he said to me, he said they went 10 seconds, you know, to on air, you know, and they started doing this countdown. It's like this cold sweat coming on. And he did actually bang it. And Jules Holland commented, he's banged it, it's going to cause him a problem.
On your first turntable, you've got a record running. On the second turntable, number 2 there, you get another record, you make sure that the beats run synchronised with each other, and you bang them in.
And this thing, tape recorder?
Well, that's the Reebok's Reeltoreel there, and that's just for echoing effects.
So you're giving it a delay like a beep, 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 beep.
Yeah, so it works in nice on some bass parts.
Yeah. Okay, then, well, I think you ought to get in and give us a demonstration of what you could do. I believe it's, if you like to step over here and you can maybe give us a bit of commentary every now and again. What's he doing now?
That's a bit of scratching on the start. The record he's playing, by the way, is David Joseph, which is a brand new single. It is one of the hottest records in the club at the present moment.
The cameraman's just jogged the record there.
That's going to give Greg a few problems, if you think.
So at the moment, what record are we hearing?
Well, it's the both record on same turntable, on both turntables, okay? On the left-hand turntable, which is 1, he's got the original version, and on the other turntable, he's following it 1 beat behind, which is given an echo effect. And you'll hear that in just about a second.
Can we have the echo?
There you go.
Oh. That was good, that bit, I like that. And of course, when you're dancing, what was that?
There we have the tape.
You put it in the tape. Yeah.
Right, it's recording what's going on and then playing it back.
Yeah. Yeah. course, I believe that lots of people go in recording studios and take lots of drugs and then just make lots of echoes, I believe.
Drugs, what are those?
No, that's what I hear.
But the needle didn't jump. So that's why those decks are brilliant. You just stay there. And it went well. And then straight after I'd done that, it switched to Camden Palace. David Joseph did it live. 2 weeks' time, he had a massive hit. It was a huge hit, you know.
It was a great song.
And then Larry Levan remixed it in New York, and it became a big New York track.
Yeah, forgive me. You weren't scratching. You were mixing on that show, right?
Yeah, I mean, I started off just at the beginning.
Yeah.
If you call it scratching.
Did they promote it? Did they talk? Did Jules Holland talk about it as being this is the first scratching or the first mixing?
Mixing.
Yeah.
But also, you know, if you look at that footage, the people are like, what? They're not interested. The crowd, they're like, what is this?
Yeah. It didn't translate like Boiler Room would do these days.
And when I'm like talking, I'm saying, you know, what you have is 2 turntables, and Jules goes, what's a turntable? And you're like, because in those days people didn't say, they said a record player. It was a record player. Only DJs kind of talked in terms of turntables and stuff. So, but it all went great. You know, I remember getting back to Manchester that night. I did a nightclub called The Exit, and everyone was shaking my hand and patting me on the back, and I thought, oh, I got through that. That was fine. And yeah, it was great. It's great to be able to do, but it's probably one of the scariest situations that I've ever found myself in.
Amazing. So when you were DJing at Legend and you had your 3 decks and you were beginning to really experiment with mixing.
Yeah.
Do you remember the first sort of mixes that you thought, yeah, I've made that switch from being a selector to being a mix DJ?
Well, I got asked to go on the radio. There was a very popular radio show called Taking Care of Business, Mike Shaft, one of the 3 biggest in the country, along with Greg Edwards and Robbie Vincent in London. And he had heard me doing the mixing, and you know, Mike Shaft, to his credit, even with I was known for playing like electro funk from New York, the kind of new technological kind of music, and although he wasn't personally into that, he understood that he had a radio show, and so he'd give a section to that, and the mix kind of did that. So it was a very early mix in the UK. There might have been a few kind of pirate things, like Froggy might have done a couple of bits and bobs, but it was a regular mix. It was the latest music coming out of the States at the time, and it took off. It was like a big thing. At the end of the year, we did a best of 82, and it was a local phenomenon. You know, and these are the days when people used to record, you know, and they'd record and take the presenter out, they'd pause him out, and they'll just keep the music together and everything. So mixes, they were like really into, and yeah. So that I was then a mixing DJ. That's what I was known as, and that's like funny because when I went to the Hacienda, which was in 83, and that had just opened the year before and was really struggling to find its identity and its crowd and everything, you know. The DJ booth was there was a stage and you had to go downstairs, and so you're in a separate room. It was like a radio studio and looking through a slat at people's feet, and it wasn't even the dance floor. And the mixer was here, and the decks were here, and I'm like, what's going on? This mixer's awful. And you had to press a button to get the volume up. And so I'm a mixing DJ who all of a sudden is working with my hands tied behind my back in this situation, and they're saying, oh no, there's only 2 of these mixers, and they're the best mix, and we got them from France and all this. They didn't know what they were talking about. Years later, I did a piece about this mixer in the Hacienda, a blog piece, and the people who made the mixer got in touch and said, it was only half the mixer, there were 2 items to it. The Hacienda had only used the 1 item and left the one with the crossfader on and everything, and that's why. But what they did the next year, they moved that DJ booth up to the balcony, and that became the iconic spot. So wherever you see like the footage, that's where it's coming from. Yeah. But during my time there, it was a nightmare. And it's like people say to me now, you know, like when I'm traveling, everyone wants to talk about the Hacienda, and you know, it's such a famous club, and that must have been the greatest experience. Like, no, it was awful. Yeah. Legend was my club. Yeah. It was all set up for me. The Hacienda still needed to find its feet, and it wouldn't have survived but for New Order having a hit with Blue Monday the Hacienda would never have got past those first 2 years because it was just these crazy dreamers who there was no business acumen in it at all. It was just madness, really.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I had the same experience. I played Hacienda a couple of times. It was always a nightmare, but it was everyone was talking about, you know, this place. So you'd go and you'd play, and there wasn't really a connection between the audience and the DJ. But I wasn't playing underneath the dance floor though. I was already up on the balcony. But there's a really good. The Dave Haston book's really good. I recommend anyone reads that if they want to know more about the Manchester scene all the way from his perspective, because he took it on a bit later on, didn't he? He was like the later DJ who, when it got into its...
Yeah, when it was really starting to kind of take off. I mean, it all came right in a moment with the Hacienda, you know, like it was once ecstasy came on the scene and once the music went more towards the kind of house side and once the guys had been to Ibiza and all that, it was the perfect environment for the people that were going to come into that. And it was an incredible club, you know, during that late 80s period. It was a very short period of time. I mean, people might come up to me and they say, oh yeah, I went to the Hacienda, you know, and I'd say, when did you go? And they'd say, you know, 93. And you kind of think, you didn't really go. You went in the building, you went in the environment, but it had gone by then because they'd had what had happened is the drug scene there had caused a reaction where after all this peace and love and everyone you met, you know, the kind of wolves moved in, saw that ecstasy was being sold for £15-20 and it got violent and guns started coming out and Manchester, from being this really incredible place, all of a sudden became quite dangerous and the Hacienda had to close and put metal detectors in. It was never the same after that. So, you know, that kind of killed it in a sense. But what happened before that was glorious, you know. And sometimes you need those big highs. There's an equal and opposite reaction and a down to it as well. You can even see that in the 60s and Pace Ashbury and all these kind of things. Something burns brightly and then there's a negative that comes on the back end of it.
So, obviously, back in the 80s, being the first guy to mix on the TV, legendary gigs, DJ of the Year in Blues and Soul, all that kind of stuff, you were on it. And you're back on it the last few years. But you took a big gap in the middle, and I'm quite interested in what made you stop and what made you start again in the DJ game. Was it the DJ thing that was what brought you back, or was it about being involved in the music or production, or was it like, it feels to me like, you know, you really took the DJing thing back on?
Okay, I mean, the stopping of it was, like we just said before, there wasn't the infrastructure that there is now. So where do you go to from... Legend was as high as it got for me. You know, where do you go to from having your perfect club? It's like people say to me now, you know, what's the greatest club you've ever worked in? Thinking I might go Space, Ibiza or whatever. And it's like every Wednesday at Legend, circa 82, 83, can't compare. I'll never get that again. It was so, you know, the time, the people that came to that, the dancing, you know, they were, this is serious. And these were kids that in the day-to-day life were getting racial abuse, they had rubbish education, the police were on the case. It was a pressure cooker and it had to come out, and it came out in this environment. And so that a guy who didn't have a penny in his pocket and didn't have any prospects in life could walk down the road and other people would nod their head and say that's such and such because he could dance, and that meant something, had currency. So it was incredibly, you know, like people will say now, what were the parties like back then to the parties now? And it's like, I don't think there were parties back then. It was something a lot more intense. It was something a lot more, it wasn't just a kind of go and have fun. They needed this for life. Without this, I don't know. And so to be a part of that, and you'll appreciate as well as being a white guy, to be accepted into that environment, it leaves such a mark with you that stayed with me. So that was, I also got heavily involved in breakdancing when it came to the UK, and I managed one of the very early crews called Broken Glass in Manchester that you know, in b-boy circles still very famous from what they did back then. And they did the TV and stuff, and I was trying to get into production, and for some reason at the time I thought I had to come away from DJing to do that. Later, obviously, DJs produce and everything, but it was a different environment. And also, I've been doing it since I was 15, and as I say, it wasn't just like you do it the weekend. I've been doing it at least 4 or 5 nights a week all that time, and I probably needed a bit of a break and to see life a bit and work it out for myself. coming back into it 20 years later, the real motivating force for me.
So when did you stop?
End of 83. So
End of 83. So a few years before Acid House happened.
Yeah,
so,
that was exactly. It was like what was happening when I stopped was I was playing all the New York electro stuff, you know, like Bambaataa, Rockers' Revenge, Peach Boys, West End Prelude labels, these kind of things, and the music that would, infuse what would become house, what would become techno, and also hip hop. Hip hop really, things like The Message.
But when you were playing records like that in Legend,
yeah,
right? Because it was quite radical, that music. It was not sort of two-step or boogie or whatever, disco, funk that you'd been playing before to a degree, disco. And your audience, quite conservative. I mean, they as you said, a lot of them, this is their moment, and they come into their club and they want their DJ to give them their food, right? And so if you come along and you drop a Peach Boys on them, at that time, did you have was it a bit of a radical thing to do, or was it natural? So that was already a step, right?
Yeah, I mean, the radical thing came, the Peach Boys was the first. The Peach Boys are a really important record, Don't Make Me Wait. That dub mix, it was the kind of hand claps and that electronic sound, and you'll hear that on Rockers' Revenge and Cinnamon, Thanks to You, which came within months of that. Producers were literally in New York taking that sound immediately, getting it out there. But that was kind of accepted by the black music fraternity. It was when at Bambaataa, Planet Rock, that kind of style, that pure electronic style of music, and a lot of the old school completely rejected that. I mean, the main London crew of DJs, the Soul Mafia, as a unit rejected it. And that was, I think their demise was as a result of that. They didn't stay with the times. And it needed the people on the Pirates, like the Max and Daves and the Masterminds in Brixton to start playing this music and bring it through. So, yeah, I mean, and I found myself in the position of heretic. The Blues and Soul, the magazine that I looked up to and everything. People were writing about me in a negative way for playing this music. This wasn't black music, they were saying, and initially it was hard. I was being attacked, and then I kind of realised that the people that were saying this were, I describe them as middle-aged white people. They're probably in their 30s, but most of them. And then looked at the crowd that I was playing to, which was young black kids. And I'm like, who are you to say what black music is? And it switched it for me, and I almost went on the offensive with it and felt more strongly. And from my perspective, you see what they were looking, they were wanting to go back to their past. And, I love soul music as much as anyone, But if I hear Otis Redding, I can't tell you, it's raw, it's a raw track. But by this point, it was like Alexander O'Neill, Luther Vandross, great artists, great singers, very polished, everything. And it was inspirational, affluent music. Whereas Planet Rock and these raw electro tracks were more akin to that Otis Redding.
Planet Rock,
yeah,
the record's come in,
yeah,
you love it.
Yeah.
You're going to play it in your club. How many times did it take for you to play it for it to become an anthem?
I think Planet Rock was a little bit of a slow burner at first because it was such a radical record and there was nothing else around quite like it. And also, what you've got to take into account is Kraftwerk. He's kind of utilising Kraftwerk, who are a white German band. And the black music scene could be quite snobby. And I'll give you an example of this. This one of the great, hip-hop records of all time, and certainly the greatest cut and scratch record for my money is The Adventures of Grandmaster Flash on the Wheels of Steel, which was 1981. Now, that was never played on the black scene, which is crazy if you listen back to that, the most black record. But the reason it wasn't played is because what he's cutting into the track, Blondie, Queen, these kind of pop acts of the time. And from a black music perspective, they weren't going to accept that. And so you were more likely to hear that in a student venue or something like that. So this idea of playing Planet Rock, of course, and I took a hell of a lot of flack for that. I remember a few months late, 3 or 4 months late, when Buffalo Gals came, Malcolm McLaren. Now you've got the guy who managed the Sex Pistols, but he's done this amazing electro track. I remember Jeff Young at Phonogram giving me a copy of it, a white label, just as they've got it in. I got the video as well, which was the first video that had all 4 elements of hip hop in. Mind-blowing thing. First time you'd seen somebody spin on their head, all this stuff was in Buffalo Gals. And, you know, you're like, I have to play this, but I know I'm just going to take a whole load of stick from a certain set of people.
Because that's the thing. What I find is quite interesting with the scene that we're talking about, this sort of era, legacy clubs and DJs in a way who basically changed the rules, and their audiences were pretty radical in the sense that they were supporting and following and dancing to music that was outside of the norm, right? But the moment that DJs like yourself, and me actually, when music changed and you started you changed that playlist to modernize it, that audience that was really radical 1 minute became really straight the next. And that's really difficult because you know you've got the best crowds, but you want to pull them somewhere new. And how did you continue? You know, did that not take your morale away sometimes because you just felt like, I really want to change the playlist, but they're not following me?
No, I mean, they went totally for it, and that was one of the things. I remember somebody wrote in Blues and Soul, they said, you know, something to the effect that I was leading them astray. And I thought, you don't lead these kids anywhere. These kids are the leaders. You're working with them. You know, it's reciprocal again. If you do it wrong, they're gone. You know, so, and they just happened to be into what I was into. I was fortunate, you know, it was a perfect marriage in that respect. And it was this young crowd coming through. But the other, I mean, where you saw it was, Wigan Pier was the other club I worked in. Again, an amazing club with fantastic sound, first club with a laser system in the UK. It was much bigger than Legend, and they established what was called a jazz funk night originally before that, so specialist black music night. It didn't just play jazz funk, it played like disco, what's now termed boogie, you know, bits of old soul funk things. So it was all in together. And when I went there, their crowd was, I'd say it was 75% white with a, you know, there was some travellers who were black that came into it, but it was more a white club. When the electro came, a lot of these people moved away from it, but fortunately we were able to bring in, and then it switched over to being a predominantly black crowd, because the people who come to Legend would then start to come to Wigan on the Tuesday. So yeah, you lost one side of the crowd who were now, oh, I don't like this new stuff, I want to stay with what we're used to. But you know, you gained it from elsewhere. And I think that's the trick. Sometimes it doesn't happen that way. You lose the crowd and there's no crowd to come, and that's, you know, that's a full stop for that. So yeah, you know, I just felt it was a natural thing. It was, well, you couldn't deny the music. If you go back and look at that music now, it's probably the last time that something really radical happened with music. Everything else is derivative. So all the electronic styles of music that have come since are all, you can bring it back. And the electro period as well it wasn't one strict style. I mean, stuff run from below 100 BPM to above 130 BPM. They were just making it up as they went along. And as I say, out of that, you know, came, for example, like with techno, one of the first techno tracks is Cybertron, Clear, One Atkins, and that was played initially as an electro. We didn't know it was from Detroit. It was just another electro track, and that was '83. You know, that was played.
So he was playing. So you were playing techno before your first retirement.
But there wasn't even there's no such thing as techno.
Yeah. And that was your kind of, so in a way, your link with that world that obviously exploded in the late 80s.
Absolutely. That track was, you know, it was One Atkins track, and it's now seen as like a really influential, but we didn't know. It was mixed by a New York guy called Jose Animal Diaz. I mean, they used to have these, you had to pay a lot of money for them, called disconnects, and they had special edits or mixes of tracks on it. It was a subscription thing for New York DJs, and he was one of the guys who did that, and he'd mix that. So it did have a New York kind of slant on it, but nevertheless, you know, its origin was Detroit, you know.
Okay, so loads gone on until 84. You've had the best times of your life at Legends, playing this amazing music, great crowd, dancers, the whole thing. Hacienda, early days. You give up or you stop, you take a break. 20 years?
20 years.
Right. What made you come back?
Right. And it's linked to the other thing, was that after that period, there's a passage of time gone now. And with passages of time, people start to document and write histories. And things were being written, and the internet had come along, and there were websites and forums where they were discussing the history. And it just became very clear that this whole period of time, it's like it didn't exist. And even with something like the rave scene, and this used to drive me mad, was a lot of people used to link it to Northern Soul. They said Northern Soul was a scene where people danced all night and took drugs to fast music. Rave is a scene where people dance all night. Therefore. And so they tried to make it a direct lineage, but what they didn't realise was that the main Northern Soul venue, the Wigan Casino, was gone by 1981. And to all intents and purposes, although it did eventually revive itself, Northern Soul was dead in the water at that point. And the Hacienda doesn't explode till 88, so what's that 7 years in between? And the 7 years in between was the black scene. And because it was the black scene, it wasn't documented as well as it should have. There weren't people within that community who were writing, for magazines. And so there's a lot of missing information from that time. And I had all my archive material from back then. Up in my loft, I had all my stuff that was there. And I wasn't DJing at the time. And I had a bit of time on my hands, and I went through it all, and I started to put it back together and did the record list, went month by month. When did I buy I had lists where I knew when I bought the records. So I was able to very meticulously go back into it, and I wrote at that point as well the basis of a book about that period, which I've never been able to get back to since, because you just haven't got the time to. Yeah. But I got the first draft down, which I've utilised for a lot of blog posts along the way to pick information from. So, and that's the site's called Electro Funk Roots, and then it dealt with that early 80s period specifically, but what led to it, what came out of it. And, the very reason was really to try to shine a light on what happened in the early 80s and the black community, which I thought was really important, especially from a British perspective. It's cultural, it's our culture. This is, what happened, and you know yourself, things like in 83, breakdancing hit the streets of the UK, and initially it was black kids that were coming out and doing this. In 84, every shopping centre up and down the country, in areas where they had no black culture, they were buying these Street Sounds albums, they were doing compilations of electro albums, and they were using them as the kind of ghetto blaster tracks and breakdown, and it just like blew up. And that was a wonderful time. I remember when we used to take Broken Glass around, we did a street tour of just shopping centres in the Northwest. And I always remember going into somewhere like Widnes, it's like this kind of out-the-way place, about 20 miles from Manchester. And we walked into the town square and stuff, and there was like about a dozen black kids. And you could see like the locals looking like, who are these? Like there's a gang walking in, and you could, in a different environment, there was going to be trouble. There was going to, it wasn't going to end well. And they saw these lads like roll out this lino and take this and put this music on. And then this beautiful thing happened. I saw these lads gravitate over and conversations, and it's probably the first time they'd ever spoke to anyone who was black. And they were, what's this music? What's this going on? And it was really wonderful, in terms of this coming to... it's so sad what's happened subsequently, that it's come back apart, because in that moment, it was very multicultural and people were coming together. And the influence that span off there. And those Morgan Khan electro albums, I think, had a massive influence on the generation that made the first rave records in the UK. I think most of those people that were making those records would refer back to that period in time. So it was a real hybrid era of ideas.
So did you feel that you had to come back and sort of put light on that era again, really sort of shine the light?
Yeah, I didn't even think about the DJing perspective initially. It was just about writing about it. But then people said, would you come back and do? And then it made sense, you know, like, yeah, you know, because I'm talking about this. And I did a gig in Manchester. One of the guys from Piccadilly Records promoted it. It seemed like the right fit and everything. And I mean, there's probably only about 100 there, but there was a right 100. And people like Ralph Lawson from Back to Basics in Leeds came over, and a guy promoted a night in Sheffield, and they both offered me. And it was this organic, and I did that, and it led to another. And then the following year, I was asked to do an album of edits. And because of the mixing, me getting into mixing, initially, when I did a mix for radio, it was as live. So you go into the club in the day, they bring in a reel-to-reel tape recorder, which happened to be a Revox B77, and they'd record it. If anything went wrong, if you messed up, and they'd go back, when we got back to the station, we'd edit it, or they'd edit it. And one day, there was no one there to edit it. And I knew that was the editing booth, and I'd seen what was done, and I went in there, and I just loved it. And I was reversing bits of tape and repeating things, and I just got into it. So like, by the end of the year, you know, like what was a mix that was done as live turned into something that took you 12 hours, 14 hours to do, or a couple of days later, because you'd be getting that involved in the editing of it. And so editing became a really big thing for me. And when I was trying to get remix work, one of the things to try and advertise myself to them was I'd take a popular track of the day and edit it round, and you know, so they could at least see that I could do something. Not that it worked or anything at the time, but later down the line, they became seen as like the original re-edits in this country. I think I did the first one, which was for Ireland, a Paul Haig track, which went to vinyl in '83. I don't think there's any what you could call a re-edits that exists before that. There's shortened edits, this, you know, like for 7-inch and things like that, but there's not a lengthened edit, you know. So I was really getting into the idea of cutting tape up. Now, in that 20 years when I was away from it, and certainly for the last 5 or 6 years, I was absolutely totally detached from the club scene. Didn't really have much of a clue what was going on at all. Got bits of information. But one of the things that was bubbling under the surface was that this re-edit culture was starting to emerge, and different people were doing these edits. So that when I came back into it, I fell right into the right place, because I was somebody associated with this from a different time. And I remember I had this Chaka Khan edit of I Feel For You that I tried to get work with back in the day. And then I played it on the first night I played, and people are like, what is this? And I'm like, this is bizarre. You know, this is something I did 20 years ago that no one was interested in at the time. Now here I am playing it, and people are, what is this? And so, I was fortunate that the following year, Turk Records had been euphonic, and they'd been heavily involved in the disco emergence in the 90s and the edits side, asked me if I'd do a compilation of edits. Choose your edits, and we'll. It was like, yeah, and that took my name, you know. So I got European gigs, and I went to the States for the first time on the back of that.
When you play your gigs, you've got your Reeltoreel, you've got your with you.
Yeah.
What does that do? Is that for reverb and what's that?
Well, the Reeltoreel, you know, after I'd been a DJ, and I was starting to produce, I started to use it. I started to record sounds. It could be samples, it could be a bit of a record, It could be a whoosh, it could be a bang. But I had all these sounds and separated, everyone was separated. And if I was in a studio doing a track, sometimes I'd just sit back and put it on and let it randomly play sounds. And then I'd hear a sound with the track and go, I like that, stop it. I might even put it in a sampler and use it a few times. I might let it be a one-time thing, but I just do this now and again. So I use these tapes. So when I came back to DJing, I had some of these tapes made. And when I did come back, it was like, what do I do? Do a vinyl? I've still got some records, or I had a load stolen in the mid-80s. CD, I've been collecting from CD since. Yeah. The third option was laptop. And that suited me because I edits as well, so we could kind of... So I went and I got a program called PC DJ. But what I really wanted, and what informed me DJing coming back, because I was aware that you know, there was a novelty value. I'm a guy from the past who worked at the Hacienda. Oh, we'll go and see that guy. But they'll only go and see the guy once, and then they'll tick him off the list, and then they'll go and see the next guy. So I had to connect with a younger age group. I knew that if there was any longevity in it, I had to do that. And so this balance of past and present to me always became important. So the idea of using new technology, i.e. the laptop, alongside antiquated technology, the Revox, appealed to me. The idea of playing older tracks, but in a new re-edited form. These things, so these fill the criteria. And I think that was the connection that enabled me to do this, rather than, if I would have just gone back in with my old box of records from back then and done it, there was only a certain shelf life.
So what does the reverb, what does the Reeltoreel actually do? Do you actually play tracks off it, or you play
No, there's two tracks. The samples go over the top of the tracks that I'm playing off CD nowadays. Yeah. But the other thing is that I have some blank tape at the end, and if you put that in record, basically what you do is you're recording what's playing, but then you're feeding it back through itself, and it's causing that infinite. That's what dub is. That's what the Jamaicans discovered with tape decks to make dub sounds. It's this feedback loop that they get, so I can use that live as well. So it has those two purposes to it.
Great. I mean, I was just looking at some of your pictures on your Instagram, and it looks like you're having a good time DJing at the moment. I mean, like the gigs that you did this week, there was a lot of people going mental at the end of the night. Are you still enjoying the DJ bit of it? You know, forget all the reason for, you know, how are you enjoying that?
No, I mean, the actual, it's like I always say with DJing, the actual gig is easy. It's everything. It's the travelling. It's like, you know, we're here and, you know, it's fantastic, but there's still, the work is all within the travelling. You come over, you know, you kind of work, you've got a few hours sleep, you're on a plane, you're somewhere else, you're trying to, so all that's the work aspect. If you're to actually be in there, that's...
Okay, so you're about to go on.
Yeah.
You and I did a gig last year in Berlin. In fact, we were both a bit stressed out.
That was funny.
Yeah, because...
it was a setup issue.
You'd done a check, you'd done a sound check, and I'd come later, and by the time I'd come there, they'd taken all your gear off, and you arrived just as I was finishing, and you were like, my gear's gone, and it was like, oh, the deck's gone. So we were both quite interesting. But before the gig, how do you get yourself sort of, you know, in the zone?
Do you know what? I don't really feel that. People said you get nervous. I don't get nervous. The one thing that technical stuff like that night, that's the thing. That's my worry, is that technically I'm not set up properly. But you know, in terms of playing, I don't have. You know, some people do have nerves, and they need nerves. They need it to feel. But I think it's just kind of individual. No, I mean.
Do you have a drink? Do you have a sort of something you do every time? Do you have a?
I mean, I don't drink too much. You know, when I'm working. No, I mean,
the buzz. You just get in there and
it's just what I do. It's you know, I kind of.
Do you have a plan of when you execute? So you're DJing. There's like a lot of people there. Have you prepared in advance? Do you just go in there and go, look, I'm just going to rely on my instincts and just play off what I've got?
More like that. I mean, it's like. In the old days, you had boxes of records, and you had as many records as you could get in there, and that was your pool of stuff to choose from. So obviously, you can't choose outside of what's there in front of you. And so that's the same thing applies now. But you see, when the whole rave scene happened, during the time I wasn't DJing, especially the 90s, there was a couple of occasions where I thought, I don't quite understand what's going on here. I worked it out eventually, but there was one, you know, there was one occasion whereby, you know, a friend of ours went to Cream, and he took a pill. He went on the dance floor. We were doing something else for a few hours, and we were going to meet him and take him, and he dancing away. And when we left, I said, "You've had a good time, haven't you?" And he said, "Oh, DJ was a bit shit." I was like, I couldn't believe it. I was like, you just danced for 2 hours, 3 hours, and you didn't like the DJ. And I realised then it was he'd taken his pill, and he was going to dance well beside anyone, and it was going to happen. And that's how it was. The other thing was DJs. It was when the term set, they started to say set. They never used to say that back in the 80s, the DJ spot or whatever. But set was something a band did, and it was a list of things. And then I realised that a lot of the DJs that were coming through in the 90s were basically during the week rehearsing what they were going to play. That was their set. So when they went out on the Saturday, they would play what they'd rehearsed, mixed by me, and it would all be perfect and wonderful. But for me, I was like, where's the spontaneity? You've locked yourself into the... You might be going to a city you've never been to before. You don't know the crowd that you're with. And then you get the DJs who say, oh, I did that... And, you know, the crowd was shit. They were all idiots. They didn't know anything. The crowd aren't idiots. The crowd only know what they know. The promoter might be an idiot for booking you in there and taking you into that environment. But the crowd, they might not have had the opening to music that you've had. And it's once you're in that environment, you've got to find some way of connecting with that crowd. Otherwise, you're just going to have a lousy time, and no one's going to. But a lot of people are so locked into what they're doing that they can't maneuver from that situation at all. So, from a DJing perspective, I'm really old school within that I would never like to be completely locked in. I might go into an environment, you know, I might be playing in Sydney on Saturday and have an idea of what I want to be playing and the type of direction I want to go in, but I might get in there, see what's going on in the club and change that slightly because it needs that, you know. So I think every occasion is different, and often, you know, the tune, you know, you hear kind of people say, oh, and such played this tune at this time and it was amazing, and he pulled out a Jimi Hendrix track and everyone, and that's the spontaneity. You would never get that if you were completely locked into a thing. So I'm not too keen on being too precise on that.
So when you play in Sydney on Saturday, what's kind of your end goal in your head? What do you want to get yourself out of the night? What's sort of the satisfactory conclusion for you?
Well, it's a bit like, say, Melbourne when I first came over. That was a really great night. And what you want is, you know, you can only get here, you know, maybe I get here once every 18 months, 2 years. And there's, you know, people who really look forward to that. You're coming out. So you want it to be special for them. You want them to go away and say that was really worthwhile and had a good night and speak to their mates, and maybe the next time bring a few mates along with them. So really, you know, you're facilitating the party, you're bringing the party to them in this sense. That's your job, your role. I mean, people say, you know, I remember people used to say to me, you're consistent as a DJ. And I thought about that, I thought, that's a prerequisite, isn't it? You've got to be consistent because it's up to you to... You know, if you're in a bad mood and doing, you know, it's going to reflect on. So at the very least, you need a level of consistency. You know, to even if you're in a bad mood and you can't bring that in there with you. You know, so, you know,
have you got tips for that when you're in a bad mood though? So you're in a bad mood, but you're consistent, but you're in a bad mood, and you know there's like 500 people out there, right? And they've paid, you know, that you've been paid a fee, and you got to deliver, right?
Yeah.
Do you kind of go radical to please yourself, to get yourself out of the bad mood, or do you go kind of, you know, because that's a risk, but it could come out really good at the end?
No, you're right. I think moods do kind of, you know, have an effect. But, you know, I don't know, maybe it's an old in the tooth thing, because I could ask you the same question, and it's just that you've got your zone, haven't you? You've done it so many times that once you go into it, that, you know, there's actually, when I'm working, there's things to do as well. It's, you know, it's funny because sometimes if in the rare occasions I don't have the Revox, I feel absolutely naked up there. It's because I'm constantly listening to things as the tracks are playing. I'm listening through. I'm doing stuff all the time, and then I'm finding a sound and playing it in with what's playing out and everything. But if I haven't got that, it's like I'm twiddling my thumb. I've got everything ready, lined up for the next mix. What do you, bit of filtering, you know, you kind of, what do you do, you know? So I think really with, you know, in regards to that question is that I don't have that much time to be in a bad mood or a negative mood because you just got to get on with it. And so, it doesn't, but it probably would affect me more if I was in a bad mood and the Reeboks wasn't there.
Right.
It would be like really banging that night.
Okay, I think we're sort of pretty much, that clock finished a while ago. That was counting down. But it's been really great hearing you. So what have you got coming up? I mean, so you've got Sydney on Saturday. Perth
Sunday.
Yeah.
Back to the UK. And then it's just like, you know, building towards Christmas. I'm playing London in Brixton New Year's Eve and Glasgow Boxing Night, you know, and a few gigs like scattered around there.
So going back to what I was saying about at the very beginning, it's like, can you keep DJing?
Yeah.
The older you get, do you think you're going to be doing it for a while longer?
I think I will always be doing it to a level, a kind of figure that you know, I would imagine that the trick to this is to do less gigs for more money.
Right. Yeah.
Let's see if I can work that one out.
Yeah.
And then, you know, maybe as you get older you do less, but
you're going to get this book done?
Eventually, if I can. Well, you know, eventually it's one of them. But I mean, a book is a funny thing because I'm not a book writer. I've never written a book, and I have mad respect for people who, especially when they were just typewriters. How did they do that? You know, like, because you've got to comb. It's like if you're mixing a track, you've got to listen to it. Say if it's a 5-minute track, and you listen through and you comb through and listen. With a book, you've got to read the damn thing, and it takes ages. You know, so. It would need to do it. I think I'd need to put aside 3 or 4 months, you know, to just like, and at the minute I just don't have that. So when it comes, it comes.
Right.
Okay, thank you so much. That was just an absolute delight. Can everyone put their hands together for these absolute champions?